the Vice President and General Manager of Pillar Technology Southeast. Prior to joining Pillar, Mike was actually an Agile Evangelist at version 1, and he's actually right here with me in the office. Mike has 20 years of experience leading IT initiatives using a combination of traditional, Agile, and lean project management best practices. Mike is a certified PMP project manager and certified Scrum Master. Mike speaks internationally on the topic of Agile project management and writes several blogs, including leadingagile.com. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Hey, everybody. How are you doing? Like Leanne said, my name is Mike Kottmeyer. I appreciate everybody joining me for the Getting Started with Agile talk today. Leanne reached out a couple of months ago, probably at this point, asked me if I was interested in doing something, possibly even kicking off the version 1 webinar series. And I was like, sure. So I've got lots and lots of talks on Agile transformation and scaling Agile to the enterprise and lean enterprise portfolio management and things like that. And so I submitted a talk over to her, and she's like, no, sorry, I want you to do something that's a little bit more introductory to get this thing kicked off. And so kind of the good thing is that forced me to sit down and really think through, what I would want to say in terms of an introductory talk, because a lot of the things that I like to write about and talk about really kind of already assume that you've got some Agile stuff going on. And so I look at this almost as like a prequel to some of my, my scaling Agile talks. So I figured if you guys are taking time to spend an hour with me here over lunch, you guys probably have a pretty good basic understanding of Agile. I would assume there's probably a lot of CSMs on the call. So I didn't want to do just a basic, this is Scrum talk. My goal here with this talk today really isn't even to tell you anything about Agile specifically or how to do it. What I'd really like to leave you guys with is a solid idea of where you should start, how to get teams spun up, and make you aware of some of the decisions and trade-offs that you're going to want to just intentionally address as you guys start to spin up pilot teams, and ultimately help you avoid making some of the mistakes that very often cause new and Agile initiatives to fail. So really my whole goal with the talk today is to get you guys started down the right path. So that first step on your road to agility is a good first step. Okay, so Leanne introduced me a little bit, but I'll just tell you just briefly about my background. As she said, that I'm an Agile transformation coach. Don't let the vice president title fool you. I'm working with Pillar here, opening up a Southeast office based out of Atlanta, Georgia. But ultimately, at the end of the day, my passion is around helping organizations build, transform into Agile enterprises. Before I was with Pillar, I was a trainer and consultant with version 1. Before that, I ran actually a pretty large Agile portfolio for Check3 Corporation, since been acquired by Fiserv. Pillar Technology as a company has been around for about 13 years, and we're just about 100 people strong. We specialize in Agile transformation and project delivery. That pretty much means we can do anything from bring Agile coaches from a leadership and project management perspective. We can bring in technical coaches to help you with continuous integration and test-driven development, and we can go as far as to spin up teams to help you deliver Agile projects. So when we get started, I was thinking about a good way to kick off this presentation, and I came across this quote in a recent blog post. I actually heard Ken Schwaber say this at the Scrum Gathering last year in Orlando. And so Ken says that he estimates that 75% of those organizations using Scrum are not going to succeed in getting the benefits that they hope from it. The first time I heard him say that, I was pretty shocked. I thought it was interesting. I was trying to think through why that might be the case. Well, some folks might tell you that the reason why that statistic is there, why a lot of folks don't get the benefit that they hope out of Scrum, is because maybe they're not following the rules of Scrum, or maybe they're not following the rules of Agile, or they're bending the practices, or they don't have the right roles, or they're not using the right artifacts. Oftentimes we think that maybe the answer is more education, or to learn how to do Scrum, or even XP better. But I think that the problem that we're facing is a little bit more fundamental than that. Over the past couple of years, I've worked with dozens of companies that are really, at the end of the day, just not really fundamentally structured to take advantage of Scrum and to do Scrum by the book. They don't have, the management structures in place. They don't have a culture that supports the openness and transparency that really Agile calls for to be successful. So at the end of the day, your culture and structure of your organization are going to really trump almost anything that you do around people, processes, and tools. You can have great people, you can have great developers in your organization, but if the weight of the organization is working against them every single day, it's going to be a slow uphill climb. Agile, for the most part, isn't really geared towards addressing enterprise processes or helping Agile teams plug in with the rest of the business. And so unless your Agile teams are aware and can function in that environment that surrounds them, they're likely not going to be successful. Or as Ken says, 75% of the teams aren't going to get the value that they expect. Tooling can help reinforce that discipline, and they can reinforce that structure of Agile. But at the end of the day, tooling can't do a reorg for you. It can't do culture change, and it can't do change management. So, a lot of times it's real easy to want to think about kind of a big top-down approach to Agile. And to be perfectly candid, that's typically how I approach things. I think real successful Agile transformations happen from the top down, and they also, happen from the bottom up. So we want leadership in place that can kind of orchestrate things, but then we want a real solid grassroots movement up underneath that. But a lot of folks within the organization, a lot of folks on this call aren't really in a great position necessarily to lead that. And what we want to do is we want to figure out how to, spin up teams within a more traditional enterprise and put them in the best possible light to be successful. So again, the ideal way is to have, top to bottom buy-in. But if we have an opportunity to make a difference within our particular part of the organization, we want to give that approach every opportunity to be successful as well. And then hopefully once we get some success at the team level, then we can scale that success up and evangelize the rest of the company. So, a lot of times what we focus on when we talk about Scrum and XP and the various Agile methods is really how to make the team high-performing. We talk about how to build a culture of trust and transparency and ownership within the team confines. We talk about how the team delivers valuable working software. But a lot of times, the context that we're working in makes the language and such very inwardly focused. It's focused primarily on software development. It's focused primarily on delivering features. It's focused on team-level best practices. The challenge is that for everything that we do to put that bubble kind of around the team and to build that cohesiveness at the team level, there's even more forces at play that are working to pull that team apart. I think I mentioned in my intro that I used to run a pretty large portfolio of Agile projects. At one time, we had over 100 people working in this particular part of the organization, and we were using a mix of XP and Scrum. And what we did is we had actually wrapped our XP and Scrum within an enterprise language that was largely driven by Rational Unified Process and PMI. And we were actually doing some really good things within that group. We were delivering some working software on 2-week increments, and we were adding what we thought was a lot of value to the company. We were delivering potentially shippable code. We were traversing a pretty complex systems architecture. And at the time, I would have considered us a pretty high-performing team. What we really weren't as good at, and ultimately what happened is that after a reorg or two, that team got broken up and dispersed out into the rest of the organization. What I think that we missed, looking back on it now that I'm a couple years removed from that experience, is I would say that our definition of value, what we thought was valuable to the organization, wasn't necessarily as valuable as we thought. We were somewhat out of alignment. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to talk for the next half hour or so about how we can get teams to focus on this idea of value. So value is a big idea within an Agile context. We always talk about delivering valuable working software. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that that value creation is in alignment very clearly with the business's objectives. And so as we talk about spinning up a pilot team, or we talk about spinning up or having an existing organization move to a more Agile way of doing things. We want to be extremely clear that we are setting up that team in alignment with something that's of value that the larger enterprise is asking us to deliver. And then so once we've identified where to spin up that team or what to align that team against, we want to talk about getting that team properly set up and getting them started. Okay, so there's a couple of things that are just kind of core to Agile that I want to introduce. We're not going to talk about daily stand-up meetings or iteration planning or anything like that, but there's a couple of concepts around team that I want to reinforce. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to get that team establishing a delivery cadence and building trust with the rest of the organization. And we're going to talk about some ways to build trust. Excuse me, I wasn't advancing my slides there. We want to talk about some ways that that team can build trust with the enterprise by delivering working software, but also communicating to the business in a language that the business is comfortable with and the business can understand. And then kind of finally, we want to talk about some of the common things that are going to be challenges that we're going to want to explicitly address and be aware of. Because again, even though we're aligned to value, even though we've got a successful team, there's certain things like matrix management and just the power and politics within the enterprise, unclear expectations, things like that, that can work against us as well. And then I'm going to close with a little bit around how Pillar helps solve some of these problems and some approaches and techniques that you guys can use to get going. Okay, so let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about focusing on value creation. So I'm pretty present out in the community. I do a lot of talking at conferences. I get out to a lot of user groups. I do a lot of blogging and interacting with blogs. I actually follow about 400 different blogs. And so periodically I see debates flare up around the community about what Agile is and what it's for. So some people say that Agile is about project management and project management frameworks and things like that. And other folks say, you know what, Agile has nothing to do with project management. It's all really about product delivery. Okay, so how are we going to do not necessarily product management, but how are we going to get products out to market? And so some folks will argue that Agile is a framework that supports product-focused organizations. With the rise of and the kind of the excitement around Kanban right now, it seems like there's some folks that kind of think of our organizations as more operationally focused. The reality is, though, is that our organizations are often all three. And if they're not all three in a single organization, different organizations focus on different things. And so from an Agile perspective, Agile can be used to support all of those. And I think oftentimes how we view Agile and what it's used for depends a lot upon our context. I don't know if anybody's ever heard the parable of the blind man and the elephant. You know, but one guy thinks that the elephant's like a rope, and one guy thinks it's like a leaf, and one guy thinks it's like a wall. The idea is that they're all kind of touching pieces of it without being able to see the whole. And the reason why this is important to us to understand fundamentally the nature of our organization and how we deliver is that the organization values something. There's some fundamental increment of production that we believe at least is going to create value for the enterprise. And so we can get kind of dogmatic and say that, you know, Agile is about product delivery. We're going to do releases. We're going to build teams around products and such. But that might be somewhat incongruent with how our organization actually delivers value. You know, we can say that projects are dead. Okay, but if our organization is fundamentally a project delivery organization, we want to be able to use Agile within that framework to be as successful as possible. At times we might consider our organization operationally focused. If it is, that's great. We might use some different approaches to manage operations, and maybe some of the stuff around projects and products isn't necessarily as relevant. So when I look at a product-focused organization, I tend to think about an organization where investments across products are not necessarily level. I don't know if you've ever worked in an organization that's kind of in maintenance mode where there's a huge suite of different applications that they've built over time, and we spin up projects to invest not necessarily in a level way across those different products. So you know, product managers will create a business case for each investment. A lot of times what we do is we find ourselves in a situation where the people will vary project to project depending upon the nature of the skill sets that are actually required. And teams tend to form and reform as projects spin up. Now this isn't, I'm not talking at this stage about interleaving projects and people getting pulled in 100 different directions. I'm really thinking about an agile organization that just spins up teams around projects, a single project at a time. Kind of the next, what I mean by a product-focused organization is where the investments are really ongoing within a single product. I looked at version 1 very much that way. There's primarily a set of applications that version 1 sells, and there's a team that's responsible for incrementing that application as we go. So investments to some degree are pre-approved and scope is negotiated release to release. Team members tend to be stable across releases and teams are better able to stay together. This tends to be, I think, where Agile gets introduced quite a bit. That tends to be the most prevailing metaphor. And so from more of an operational perspective, I tend to think of teams that are formed around operations as kind of similar to product teams. Teams can generally stay together. Investments tend to be level over time. But they're often characterized by rapid changes to the product backlog based on immediate demand. So depending upon the nature of our organization, we want to make different decisions about the pieces of Agile, the methodologies, and our expectations around teams and our expectations around delivery. So I just want to address that because a lot of times it's very easy for us to make assumptions about the nature of our organization. And what I'm suggesting is that we want to be very explicit about how our organizations are really behaving, especially when we're looking at spinning up a single team within a larger, more traditional enterprise. So from a what do we value perspective, this is another thing that I see quite a bit of discussion around in the community. A lot of times within Agile we talk about, the value is that we can work with our customers, we can inspect and adapt as we go, and we can let the requirements and the architecture and the design and such emerge. That's true. That is absolutely a benefit of Agile, but not every organization values that. Some organizations value more predictive outcomes, where we're not necessarily trying to emerge a set of requirements. What we really want to do is we want to converge on some particular business outcome, some set of scope that we've got a time and a cost to deliver, to be able to deliver something that's very specific. Okay? Some organizations are more interested in managing flow. So in an emergent organization, change is encouraged. It's focused on optimizing business outcomes, not necessarily driving to a specific product set. Features often vary based on customer input. We can drop something into market in 2 weeks. We can get some feedback. We can change it in the next 2 weeks. And so in this case, and this isn't a hard, fast rule, this is, I tend to think of emergent outcomes or implementations of Agile that are focused on emergent outcomes as being primarily a mechanism for fast feedback and helping guide the organization into what to build. If I'm looking at Agile from a predictive perspective, change is not as desirable. We want to focus on converging into a set of requirements. We want to balance technology, we want to balance requirements to get to a particular set of things that we actually want to place in market because we believe those items will actually deliver the business outcomes that we're looking for. Oftentimes, this is a situation that consulting organizations get into. The customer has a really clear idea of what they expect. They know what they want to put in to market, and they're asking you as an Agile team to deliver that for them. Okay, so in these environments, Agile is primarily a mechanism for rapid risk reduction and learning. I can use iterative development. I can use the fast feedback to rapidly get the risk out of my project and make sure that I'm going to be able to deliver against that predictive outcome to the best of my ability. So when I'm focused on managing flow, I'm in a situation where I've got constantly changing backlogs, and really what we need to do is we need a way to understand capacity. We need a way to make and meet short-term commitments. And Agile is primarily really a scheduling mechanism to help us understand things like velocity or cycle time or something like that. Okay? So understanding that Agile is not a one-size-fits-all methodology and that our organizations are very unique gives us a language and a way of thinking about our businesses that will help us decide where we want to spin up that first Agile team, or possibly even where we want to take an existing team and align it with some increment of organization value. So the first thing when you're looking at choosing the Agile pilot team is you want to understand how your organization creates value. So what is it? Is it some business process improvement that we've spun up a project to address? Is it a new feature that we're going to put in market? Is it the ability to reduce the time that it takes us to satisfy a customer's request? There's lots of things that any given organization will value. Okay, so when we're doing this kind of assessment, we look through and we say, okay, what is the value model of the enterprise? What are the things that are going to actually drive revenue? They're going to drive business benefit. The next thing that we want to look at is where is that value constrained? What are the problems? It might be within a particular part of the organization. It might be within a particular set of practices within an existing organization. Okay, but at some point in time, we can look at that organization and we can see what is preventing that value from coming out. So I tend to think about spinning up Agile pilot teams where the idea of value and the constraint kind of intersect. So if I can find something that isn't working extremely well, but if I fix it will unlock a tremendous amount of value for the enterprise, then that's a pretty good place to start, okay? Because that enables me to make what I'm doing with my Agile team extremely visible. Now, I would certainly take into consideration risk. I mean, you don't necessarily want to, what do they say, change the wheels on the car in mid-flight in an extremely high-risk project. But in general, if you come from any kind of a traditional project management background, we know that the only way to get better outcomes on a project or, gosh, a product for that matter, is to shorten the critical path. And so really what we're suggesting here is to get more value, we want to focus resources on the constraint. And that's often a pretty good place to spin up an Agile pilot team. So the importance of this, and the reason why I wanted to set the stage this way, is because very often what we do is we just kind of take our existing organizations, our existing product lines, whatever it is that we happen to be working on, and we say, hey guys, we want to go Agile. And that's great, right? And that will help the team, and the team will do great work, and the team will get better. But if that benefit isn't visible to the external organization, just like in my example back when I was in that 100-person portfolio, we were doing great, we were building great software, but the output of our efforts was not as closely aligned with what the enterprise saw as valuable as it could have been. So once we've decided what is the most valuable thing to start the pilot team up around, we want to make sure that we get that team in place and we give them everything that they need to be successful. So this little circle, I don't know if you caught this from the earlier slide, this is how I tend to represent teams. It's kind of like a Scrum team. It's kind of encapsulated. It has a product owner. That's the blue dot. Okay? And so what we want is that when we form up a team, an Agile team, is that we want to make sure that the team has everything that it needs to be successful. So we want to give it developers. We want to give it testers. If it needs analysts, we want to do that. If it needs a product manager or a project manager or a certified Scrum Master or something like that, we want to make sure that the team has that as well. We want to have somebody that's responsible for giving that team direction and helping to manage its backlog. Okay? That's important because what the team's going to do is the team's ultimately going to be responsible for delivering an increment of value to the business, and it needs to have everything at its disposal. A couple years ago, I took the Ken Blanchard Situational Leadership course, and I've been a fan of this little diagram ever since, so I thought I would show it to you. It largely talks about, the leadership styles as teams form. And so I don't know how closely this is aligned with the forming, storming, norming, performing model, but it seems to make sense to me. So as we're spinning up teams, very early on when a team gets spun up, we have to be in kind of a high directive, low supportive behavior. As the team matures, we go to high direction, high support. As the team gets into kind of more of a normalization mode, we can get into high support and low directive. And then towards the end, we can get to very low support, low directive behavior. So kind of what we do quite often by spinning teams up, pulling people in and out, having people work on multiple projects at a given time, what we in effect do is we keep people in the forming and storming phases indefinitely. Okay, they don't really have a chance to become that high-performing team to where they can get to a place where they can self-organize and self-manage. So this idea of giving a team everything it needs, keeping the churn of the team members as little as possible, and then putting those team members in a position where they can stay in performing mode as long as possible. Okay, that's a huge consideration when you're thinking about Agile teams. Now, if you had a project-based organization, you might say, well, hey, I'm spinning up teams depending upon the needs of the project. Absolutely, that's a trade-off, and so we know that early in those life cycles, we're going to have to be more directing before we can get to more delegating. But we know that through the life of that project, then we'll get to a point where that team can become high-performing as well. And then maybe at that point, we want to consider not breaking them up either and figuring out projects that they can do rather than forming teams around projects. So there's lots of options that we have here. But the key point is we want to get everybody that the team needs, and we want to put them in a situation where they get to work together for an extended period of time. So we can really use light touch leadership. We can allow them to self-organize and even to some degree self-manage. So the goal is, with Agile, okay, is that we want to take these high-value features that we've identified, whether they be projects or user stories up underneath a project or features within a product, or maybe it's even something like a support queue, where we want to be able to get the team a prioritized list of the things that need to be fixed pretty quickly. And we want to assign that work to the team. We want to give them that backlog. Okay? And then on the backside, we want to create working software. Okay? And the whole trick with Agile here is we've got this prioritized list that's focused on enterprise value. We give it to a very mature, self-organizing team that has everything it needs to be successful, and they build software for the organization. Okay? That's generally it. And that might sound really obvious to you, and gosh, I hope all, I think what we've got almost 150, 200 people on the call. I hope that that's really evident to you. But it's amazing how many organizations that you go into where people are matrixed across. They're not parts of persistent teams, and they're not working on the highest value items first. And I think that's a huge factor in the reason why Agile fails more often than not, is because we don't put the teams in a position to be successful, and we don't give them everything that they need to be successful. So once we've aligned the team with value and we've given the team everything that they need to be successful, we need to make some decisions about how it is that they're going to operate. Now, ideally, I'd love to have the team make those decisions about how they need to operate, but sometimes we have standards and training and stuff, and that's okay. We want the teams to be able to inspect and adapt and choose some practices. But Scrum isn't the only thing that they have to choose from. Okay, so Scrum's minimally prescriptive. We've got 3 roles, 3 artifacts, 3 ceremonies. It provides the basic framework for inspection and adaptation. Very, very powerful concept. Brings all of the challenges with the team to the surface in form of impediments and allows us to work on them. But more often than not, I think I actually saw something in the version 1 Agile survey that the most widely adopted Agile methodology right now is a mix of Scrum and extreme programming. So I think the community is realizing that Scrum by itself, especially in a technology environment, doesn't stand alone. It's really the things like test-driven development, pair programming, continuous integration and such that really make Scrum work in a software engineering environment. But even that is not totally sufficient for every environment. I mentioned that we were actually putting an Agile Unified Process wrapper around our Scrum and XP implementation. If you happen to live in the UK, you might be familiar with DSVM. It brings some things to the table that really help Agile scale out into the broader enterprise. Okay? So you're not limited by Scrum, you're not limited by XP. You've got some other things at your disposal that help you deal with the broader life cycles associated with Agile software development. Lean is kind of big right now. I think what we're seeing is that just like XP helps make Scrum work at a single team level, what I think we're learning is that Lean, theory of constraints, things like that, is really helping us with the enterprise portfolio management piece of this. Kanban's emerged here recently, which is kind of interesting. It can be looked at as a team-based practices that gives managers a few more hooks into the into what's going on so they can help get the teams what they need, and the teams can use like a Kanban board to be able to focus on their constraints within just even within the team itself. I think there's some really interesting applications of Kanban up at the enterprise level, again, kind of in this lean portfolio management to help understand your constraints across multiple steps in the value stream. Okay, so we don't want to sit there and just go, okay, it's just Scrum, it's just XP. We want to look at this breadth of knowledge that has been aggregated over the last 15, 20 years and really choose some best practices that are going to enable our single team to interface as well as they can with the rest of the enterprise, okay? Because again, our context here is we've got a single Agile team within this more traditional cloud. Okay, I want to give them everything that they need to be successful. So kind of following this idea of linking the team out to the rest of the enterprise, Agile, especially what I call small team Agile, tends to start with, hey guys, let's get in and let's start iterating through the backlog. Okay? Well, where does architecture and design come in? Well, it emerges, right? Where does deployment and hardening come in? Well, that happens every sprint. Well, in some environments it does, and certainly there are environments where that works. I think Scrum is starting to realize that there's this bit of time up front we call iteration 0, where we're doing some architectural spikes maybe, we're helping to elaborate the backlog, we're getting our baseline environments in place, and that's something that happens before the team really gets going. I think in some environments we're starting to realize that there is a need for a hardening sprint. I worked with a company that did handheld software for financial institutions. And there's just no way that the financial institutions and the carriers were going to allow them to drop software to them every 2 weeks. And so there was a period at the end of the iterations where they had to go into a hardening phase, and the customer actually looked at it for the first time. Is it the way we'd like to do it? Maybe not, but it makes sense in some points. What we want to realize, though, is that regardless of whether we're talking about just software development or delivery of a product or a project, is that happens within a broader enterprise context. So where does the business begin to mitigate its risk, and where does the business begin to decide what are the pieces that we actually want to bring to market? Okay? That doesn't always happen in iteration 0 in Scrum. Again, in the Agile Unified Process world that I was living in, large corporation, a lot of that business validation, a lot of the product and project selection actually happened in an inception phase, where we balanced the business needs against kind of the larger architectural kind of possibilities that were available to us. And then we would also have a transition on the backside, which was even a little bit different from the hardening iteration, where the customer actually took ownership of it and brought it into their environment. Okay? So sometimes Agile's living within that slightly broader framework. You might even consider that there's a framework for spinning up projects that live even outside of that. Okay? Making decisions about which products to approve. Okay, what is the roadmap? How does something get into the roadmap? How do I initiate a business case to go in front of the board so that I can even begin to plan and engage resources and execute, monitor, and control, and all that kind of stuff. So the point here is that what we want to do is that our team, our Agile team that we spin up that's focused on value and has everything that it needs to be successful, lives within a broader enterprise context. Okay? So what we need to do is we need to be aware of that broader enterprise context and make sure that we put the appropriate hooks in place so that everybody understands what they're going to get and when they're going to get it. Okay, so now we're in a situation where we've formed the team, we've aligned it to value, we've given it everything it needs to be successful, we've chosen a methodology that's respectful of this broader enterprise context that it needs to operate in. Okay, so again, you see we're building kind of an onion here to set this team up for success. Okay? We want its success to be aligned with business outcomes, and we want its success to be congruent with the rest of the organization. So now it's up to the team to deliver. They've got everything that they need. So when I think about spinning up Agile teams and putting them in a position to deliver, one of the first things that I do is I say, okay guys, let's start with the breadth of the problem, and then let's go into the depth. This is how we kind of avoid the big upfront design. Okay? For years I've been saying I need to put a picture of a cone of uncertainty into my talks, and since I was building this talk this week, I decided I was going to go and grab one, and I found this one from Methods and Tools, I think, is what the name of the website was. So basically, what this is saying is that early in the project, there's or product or even an operational life cycle, that kind of a thing, we've got a tremendous amount of uncertainty in terms of what it is that we're going to build. And as we iterate, we want one of our goals to be is that we want to get to a point where we know more about the project. And so whether it be a product converging into a release or whether it be a project converging into a set of business requirements, okay, we want to iterate and we want to learn and we want to intentionally narrow that uncertainty as we go. That's how we rapidly reduce risk in Agile projects. We reduce the requirements risk by building the stuff that allows us to be able to reduce the business uncertainty. We build the stuff first that allows us to reduce technical uncertainty as fast as possible. And so from a requirements perspective, that looks like we start with epics, we break them down into features. You could argue whether features become before epics or not. I'm not really interested, but basically we take big stuff, we break it into smaller stuff, and then we ultimately break it down into things that can be consumed by the teams. We can do user stories. Those user stories now get consumed by that self-organizing, self-managed, mature, technically astute, sound development practices team, okay, and we build working software. And then as we build that working software, we learn from it, and we feed that back up, and that influences our user stories. So there's this two-way street. This is kind of what I call the conversion. So the next thing that we want to really make sure, I don't know if any of you guys are coaches on the phone here, but if you ever go into a coaching engagement, one of the first things you want to look for is how are they doing on their technical practices, okay? Because it's very hard to do all of the emergent stuff, develop in thin slices, get the constant feedback if you're not doing things like test-driven development. If you don't have an environment where you can do continuous integration, where you don't have the quality and the checks and balances associated with pair programming. It's really hard to change a code base that's big and complicated. Okay? So again, even though I tend to approach engagements more from a project management, leadership, enterprise transformation perspective, we want to come in and we want to take a look and we want to see what the health and well-being of their technology is. Because we can put in the best Scrum, we can use Agile Unified Process, whatever, connect to the rest of the business, deliver value. But if we're accumulating a bunch of technical debt in our code base, that's going to cripple us really fast. I can't tell you how many teams I've seen with just wildly swinging velocity that can't get predictable. And it's usually something as straightforward, I don't want to say simple, but as straightforward as not having a reliable continuous integration environment so they can get that working code out every 2 weeks. And so ultimately, what teams do with the rest of the organization is they begin to build trust by delivering software. Okay, we build trust with the business by making commitments periodically and doing what we say that we're going to do. So the organization might have this vision of a roadmap that is broken out into releases, but we start establishing a cadence of delivery, iteration over iteration, that enables us to go back to the business and say, hey, look, we're able to deliver on your highest priority features. We're able to deliver working software. Our organization is in sync with the rest of the business. Okay? We want that level of congruence. We want that alignment. We want that focus on business objectives constantly. Okay? And a lot of that's implied in Scrum, right? I'm not saying that Scrum or XP or whatever doesn't talk about it. There's a huge emphasis on product owners and customers and things like that. But the main difference here is that we've got our team aligned to measurable, tangible business outcomes. And then kind of last but not least, and coming out of a more traditional PMI background, one of the things that I'm big on is communicating to the business in language that they understand and are comfortable with. And so, a lot of times internally we talk about velocity, we talk about burn down graphs, sometimes we'll talk about, cumulative flow diagrams, things like that. A lot of those things are focused inward at the team, and they help the team inspect and adapt and understand where it's at against the backlog. And all of that stuff is great for helping the teams get better. And a lot of times our answer is, well, have the teams come, or have the senior leadership come down and look at the burn down charts on the wall. And that's great, and maybe you've got senior leadership that will do that. But a lot of times what it is, especially in a multi-team environment or where your team is dependent upon other teams within the enterprise, maybe even non-Agile teams in the enterprise, to deliver value, what we want is we want to communicate in a way that helps the organization understand. Sometimes it's as simple as a red, yellow, green status that I update from my velocity and my burn down. There have been times when I've used very high-level Gantt charts to help communicate kind of where I expect to be based on my velocity. And then as I move, from iteration to iteration, I can kind of roll up and, talk to the business side project manager or something like that and give them updates on how we're doing. So, as we're introducing Agile, we don't want to be divisive. We don't want to say, hey, this is the way. Okay, it is the way, right? Or else we all wouldn't be spending our lunchtime talking about this stuff. But we want to do it in a way that's respectful of where the rest of the organization is at with us. And so now what we've done is we've, again, created this team, solid practices, delivering value, aligned with business objectives, has everything that they need to deliver. We're still going to have some forces of nature around us that we want to make sure that we're very explicit about. One of the most common, and this is very, very hard to deal with in most organizations, is the idea of matrixing. Typically, somebody has a functional manager, they're matrixed into a project team. We really try to optimize for the usage of the individual on the team, so we split people across multiple projects to take advantage of their specialized skill sets. We want to try to evolve to a way, especially on our Agile project team, where we acknowledge that and we deal with it, and we try to pair people together and turn them to some degree into specializing generalists. We don't need everybody on the team to be able to do everything, but we typically need people on the team to be able to do more than one thing. That enables us to level out some of the bumps. Okay? So be real intentional about matrixing, understand the pull that that's going to put on the team. It's going to try to bust up the team. It's going to dilute their focus on the business outcomes. Okay? It's going to put them into forming and storming all the time. Okay? So we want to keep people together by encouraging them to be generalists, but maybe with a specialty or two. Power and politics always comes into play. Whenever you start forming high-performing teams within the enterprise, maybe it's the dev manager, maybe it's the director of QA, whatever, somebody's going to have their power base threatened. And that's the reason why I talk a lot about aligning with business value, speaking the language of the rest of the organization, giving people what they need to be successful. Because while you're spinning up your Agile team and while you're in these early stages of Agile adoption, you have to make it safe for everybody. You want to make it safe for the team. You want to put them in a position to be successful. But you also want to make it safe for the organization. Okay? They need to understand what it is that they're going to get, when they're going to get it, kind of how they're going to get it. And they need to kind of know that their jobs are going to be there at the end of the day if this thing really takes off. Mixed mode teams. I was considering talking about this earlier in the presentation, but a lot of times it's not just as simple as we're a project organization or a product organization or an operationally focused organization. I've worked with lots of teams that are responsible for building a product. They have projects come into their queue, and they're also responsible for doing support. So very challenging, right? So it's hard to establish a steady velocity, especially when a team is responsible for support and for doing project and product work. Product ownership. I don't necessarily mean a product owner, not necessarily a single product, but the organization needs to figure out kind of how it's going to feed information into that team. At the end of the day, I want the team to have a prioritized product backlog. However that comes to pass is fine, but all that stuff needs to be interleaved into that prioritized product backlog. So it kind of goes without saying, unclear expectations, well-communicated expectations. Don't talk in code, don't talk in Agile speak. Let's communicate to the business in language that they understand, help them understand the differences and how what you're doing with your Agile team is contributing to value. I have a story I tell quite often where I was extracting all this Agile data for our organization and communicating it up into the PMO in terms of schedule variance, cost variance, other earned value metrics. I'd even translate it in hours spent, all that kind of stuff. Just so the team can operate in an Agile way, but I wanted to communicate to the language of the business so they knew what to expect and when they could get certain things. And then another challenge, this is really hard, but hopefully we've solved it already by aligning the Agile pilot team with the value-generating activities of the organization. But it's very easy to get in a situation where the team has great velocity, but they're actually not able to drive value outside the organization. You can think of that in a situation where maybe it takes 7 or 8 teams to deliver a product suite. 2 or 3 of them have great velocity, Okay, maybe they're your Agile teams. You got 5 or 6 of them that aren't delivering as fast. Right? So you guys can be great at delivering high value. You can have great velocity, but it doesn't map up to enterprise value. That's why we want to get that Agile team focused on creating real enterprise value. So some of the things that we do to help out with that kind of thing, come in, do baseline agility assessments, look at things like, are you refactoring, are you doing continuous integration, are you doing retrospectives, to understand where you're at in terms of your Agile practices against what we would consider really kind of a healthy team. Enterprise value modeling, breaking down the organization and really helping the business understand what those value-creating activities or initiatives or products or operations really are. Facilitating a conversation that helps make that really clear. Current reality diagrams, helping an organization understand where that value is constrained. Okay, because again, remember, it's the intersection of value and really constraints or opportunities for improvement where we want to focus our early Agile initiatives. I think that's where we've got the greatest chance of having a lot of bang for our buck. Coaching and training, absolutely important to have folks helping your folks learn how to do this better. Pillar also does this thing called a control team, which is pretty cool, where you get kind of a team together that really knows how to do this stuff, and then use that as kind of a model while everybody else is coming up to speed. Put control teams around your highest value, highest constrained items, and then use that as kind of a baseline for being able to drive Agile best practices out into the rest of the organization. So I'm running out of time here. I'm actually over time, so I apologize. We'll still have some time for questions. I'm not that much over time. But basically what we're going to do, what I hope you've learned here today is that we're going to meet the organization where it is. We're going to understand how it creates value and what it values. And then we're going to build Agile teams around things that can actually have a serious impact. Okay? We want to build organizations ultimately out of Agile teams. So as I spin up one team around some creation of value, the next team I spin up, I want to spin it up around a creation of value. And then I have multiple of these things running around the enterprise, all of them with everything they need, specializing generalists, all the things that we talked about. I want you guys to leave with the idea that working software, working valuable software that's in alignment with the rest of the organization builds trust. Using the language of the rest of the organization builds trust. Okay, this is a high trust activity. We don't want to be part of the body pile of Agile teams that have been dismantled because the rest of the business couldn't figure out what to do with all that great software that they were out there creating. And then ultimately inspect and adapt and get better over time, replicate that success out to the enterprise. And hopefully if we do this right, then we have a shot at getting somebody's attention, and then we can start doing the big, kind of the top-down senior leadership play, in alignment with a really good, solid grassroots movement, and ultimately make your enterprise successful. So with that, I'm going to have a sip of coffee. I think Leanne is going through and looking for some questions here. And so
we've got some. It looks like we maybe had a little glitch with the slides not updating. So it looks like a lot of the questions we have actually were around that. We will be able to email out the presentation as soon as we're done today, so we'll be going through that. So if you guys have any questions specifically to the talk, definitely please encourage you to get those.
Scroll down a little bit. Let's see what we can do. Is it really? Is it still stuck? It was changing on my side. Unfortunate.
I do apologize to everyone here that it looks like the slides somehow got stuck. We do have a question around how do you handle surprise stories in an Agile environment, stuff that comes up.
Stuff that comes up in the middle, okay? Well, so I'm not saying that something doesn't ever come up, but one of the things that I would start with is I would look at and I would say, did we understand the breadth of the solution? Were we driving from a risk-driven perspective? Okay? If I've done an appropriate level of architecture, barely sufficient level of architecture up front, a barely sufficient level of requirements modeling up front, I want to minimize the number of surprises. that come up, okay? So that's kind of my starting place. I don't want to look at surprises as the norm. But like, let's say, for example, that you are building out a product and you have a situation where a support story comes in the middle of the iteration. You've got a couple of options. You can add it to the backlog, and you can prioritize it against other things in the backlog at the next iteration planning meeting. Or you can choose to take something out of the current iteration and drop something in. Okay, so I'm not saying that there's a one-size-fits-all answer. It gets into a lot about velocity and predictability and things like that. I typically go from the standpoint of trying to figure out how to minimize those surprises. I don't want that to be a pattern within my organization because it's very, very hard to make commitments and build trust if you're constantly getting hit with things that you didn't see coming.
So the next question we have is around how do you benchmark success and how do you benchmark that on improvements in productivity driven by Agile?
Have you benchmarked, let's say it again.
Benchmarking what you're doing before, and then how do you benchmark that against your Agile adoption?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things at play. So if you saw the spider diagram that I put up, one of the things that we do at Pillar is we'll come in and do an assessment of the organization. We'll understand where you're at in terms of the agility ready practices. And then at the retrospectives, maybe not every retrospective, and periodically we'll update that and see how we're progressing over time. Typically, it's kind of hard when you're looking at actual productivity improvements because Agile teams tend to measure productivity different, right? So in a more traditional organization, I might measure productivity in terms of hours worked against hours planned, something like that. When I go into an Agile environment, now what I'm looking at is what was the velocity of my team, okay, or what was the cycle time of my team. With a velocity metric, I might baseline my velocity early on, and then I measure improvement over time. So let's say I couldn't deliver anything for the first sprint or two, and then I get a velocity of 15, then I get a velocity of 30, then I get a velocity of 50, and then it kind of stabilizes there, okay? So that's typically how we do it. Okay, it's not necessarily an apples-to-apples comparison because the team wasn't doing Agile before, and they didn't have value-driven metrics. Okay, now that we're going to value-driven metrics, we can start looking at the team over time and seeing how they're improving.
The next question we have is around, can Agile be used outside of development, can it be used in other departments?
Yeah, so well, absolutely. So when I was here at version 1, we were doing some coaching with the marketing team, okay? And so version 1's marketing team is an Agile organization now. A lot of times you'll be in a situation where the whole company gets structured as Agile. Pillar is an Agile run company. I believe version 1 is an Agile run company. I've actually run a small private school using Agile practices. You hear Jeff Sutherland talking about using Scrum to run churches. So absolutely, the principles behind Agile can be used anytime you want to create an environment of inspection and adaptation and then constant feedback.
So the next question we have is how much upfront architecture is required?
Yeah, so when I saw that one come up, I told Leanne I really wanted to try to answer that. That's the magic question, right? And I don't know that there are any easy answers to it. Where I tend to start with is barely sufficient, right? I look at anything that I document, write down, plan in advance as a way of mitigating risk. So if I've got a high degree of risk that various teams aren't going to understand what's going on, or if I get into a project and there's a tremendous amount of, like I hate to use words like infighting or swirl around technical decisions, then I want to do just enough architecture to be able to get those issues worked out. I want it to be barely sufficient. I want it to be focused on resolving problems. I want it to be focused on mitigating risk, creating a shared understanding across the various teams, okay? So I'm pushing it just a little bit until I feel that my risk is sufficiently reduced. And so, one of the things that I just say kind of tongue-in-cheek is that when I'm working on a large project that has multiple large-scale components in it, something like that, I want to know what the big blocks are, right? I want to know the major changes to the major architectural components, just in terms of a paragraph or two. Not talking about detailed design, not talking about UML. I want to facilitate a conversation for understanding. I want everybody in the room to be on the same page about where we're taking this product from a technical perspective. Okay, and so not a one-size-fits-all answer. There's an art to it, but just barely sufficient for the purposes of communication is where I'd like to leave that.
The next question we have is around how to manage testing in Agile.
Okay. Well, so a lot of times it depends on the kinds of testing that you're asking about, right? So testing happens at, the unit test level. It happens at the regression test level. It happens at integration tests. Some organizations have manual testing. Some organizations have large-scale UAT testing where they get it out in front of the users. Okay. So again, you can imagine not necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer. So generally, Agile teams try to automate as much as absolutely possible. So whether it be unit tests, regression tests, integration tests, that kind of a thing. We want to build tests around it. We want to automate that as much as we possibly can because we realize that we're going to be changing things every 2 weeks. And going through and rerunning manual regression tests all the time is extremely time-consuming. So typically what we see is developers or Agile testers that can write some code automating as much as possible. But it's pretty common for a lot of Agile teams to have somebody who actually goes in and exercises the application end-to-end and looks at it from a, how do I break this? What are the edge cases that I can kind of throw at this? But that becomes a much less rigorous process and more exploratory testing as we go. And again, just like with the architecture, the testing becomes feedback to the development team to be able to fix problems very early.
Well, we've got a lot of questions still in queue, and we don't have, unfortunately, the time to get to all of those. So wanted to thank you, Mike, for your time today and sharing your insights into how to get started with Agile, and leave you with the last word.
Okay, guys, I just appreciate you coming out. If you guys have any questions, I'm trying to think. I want to make sure that I have, I'll leave this up here for just a minute. There's my contact information. Feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call. I'll be happy to follow up with you offline. Check out Pillar's website at pillartechnology.com. You can follow me on Twitter. You can check out my blog, leadingagile.com. I write about a lot of these kinds of issues here. And just look forward to the conversation, and don't hesitate to